My name is Ethan Cole. I'm in my late 30s, and for most of my adult life, I've been someone people rarely notice until something stops working. I've built my career in offices where the lights stay on late, where conversations sound confident, but certainty is often borrowed, not earned. I've always been the person behind the structure, steady, precise, and quiet. If you asked people who worked with me how they'd describe me, most would use safe words: reliable, calm, low ego, someone who doesn't cause friction. I was never the loudest voice in the room, never the one who pushed himself forward. I listened more than I spoke. I took notes when others spoke in headlines. Over time, that made me useful, but it also made me easy to overlook. I learned early that being dependable doesn't always make you visible. In some environments, it does the opposite. You become background noise, something assumed rather than acknowledged. People stop checking in, stop asking what you think. They assume you'll be there, that you'll adapt, that you'll carry the weight quietly because you always have. This story isn't about anger, it isn't about revenge, and it isn't about proving anyone wrong in a dramatic way. What changed was my understanding of how I was being positioned and what I chose to do once I finally saw it clearly. I want to be honest about one thing from the start. Losing my job hurt. There were no raised voices or slammed doors, just a scheduled meeting, neutral language, and a decision that had clearly been made long before I was invited into the room. 10 years of work reduced to a few carefully worded sentences about direction and alignment. What hurt most wasn't the loss itself. It was the realization that my consistency had been mistaken for replaceability, that my silence had been interpreted as acceptance, that the version of me they saw was smaller than the one I actually was. This story follows the moments that led up to that realization and what came after. The small dismissals that didn't seem important at the time, the patterns I rationalized because challenging them felt unnecessary or even ungrateful. The way I stayed quiet was not because I was weak, but because I believed patience would eventually be rewarded. There are no villains here, just people acting within systems that reward confidence over contribution, speed over depth, and one person, me, slowly understanding that silence can either be a habit or it can become a choice. I'm sharing this not to dramatize the outcome, but to document the process, because many people experience something similar without ever naming it. They feel overlooked, undervalued, quietly displaced, and they assume the problem is them. If you've ever been the person who carried responsibility without recognition, who stayed professional while others advanced more loudly, who believed loyalty would speak for itself, then this story may resonate. So, before we go any further, let me ask you something. Softly, honestly, have you ever realized that the moment people stop listening is often the moment you start seeing most clearly? For a long time, I didn't think of myself as invisible. That word feels too dramatic, too self-pitying. I showed up every day. People greeted me by name. My calendar was always full. My work was relied on. So I told myself I was seen. But being relied on is not the same as being recognized. I learned that difference slowly. At work, I was the person teams leaned on when something needed to be stabilized. When a project went off schedule, I was brought in quietly to help smooth things out. When a client relationship became tense, my manager would ask me to join the call, not to speak, but to listen, to take notes, to make sure nothing was missed. After meetings, people would say things like, "Glad you were there," or "Thanks for catching that detail," and then move on. No one ever asked me what I wanted next. I wasn't the type of person people worried about losing. I was the type they assumed would always adapt. If a deadline moved, I adjusted. If responsibilities shifted, I absorbed them. If credit drifted upward to someone else, I let it. Not because I didn't notice, but because I believed consistency mattered more than visibility. Over time, a role was quietly assigned to me. Not on paper, not in a job description, but everyone seemed to agree on it without discussion. I was the safe pair of hands, the one who didn't complain, the one who would handle it. In meetings, I often spoke last, if at all, not because I lacked opinions, but because I waited to see what the room needed. When louder voices filled the space, I stepped back. When decisions were rushed, I slowed things down privately afterward, rewriting plans, correcting assumptions, filling gaps no one wanted to acknowledge. I told myself this was professionalism, maturity, leadership without ego. What I didn't realize was that people had begun to define me by my restraint, not my capability. New hires were introduced to the team with enthusiasm. Their backgrounds are highlighted. Their potential is discussed openly. When I was mentioned, it was usually in passing. Ethan will help you with that. Ethan knows the process. Just check with Ethan. He's been here forever. That phrase, he's been here forever, was said like a convenience, not an achievement. I trained people who would later become my supervisors. I documented processes that others presented as innovations. I stayed late fixing problems that were publicly credited to someone else's leadership. None of this felt malicious. It felt structural, normal, easy to ignore, and so I ignored it. I told myself that my work spoke for itself, that long-term value was quieter than short-term attention, that recognition would come when it mattered. I believed that staying grounded, staying useful, staying calm was a kind of investment. Looking back, I can see how I made myself easy to overlook, not by shrinking, but by never insisting on space. When performance reviews came around, my feedback was always positive, reliable, consistent, low drama. Those words were meant as compliments, but they came with no expansion, no new authority, no meaningful conversation about growth. Just reassurance that I was doing exactly what was expected. And that was the problem. I was doing exactly what was expected. To them, I wasn't a risk taker. I wasn't a future leader. I was infrastructure. Something solid you don't think about unless it fails. I didn't resent my colleagues. I didn't feel angry at my managers. I felt neutral, which at the time felt like balance, like emotional intelligence. But neutrality can become a kind of erasure if you never challenge the story others are telling about you. They thought they knew who I was. They thought they understood my limits. They thought my quiet meant contentment. And because I never corrected them, that version of me became the only one they saw. I didn't yet realize that how people perceive you, if left unchallenged long enough, becomes the justification for how they eventually treat you. At that point in my life, I still believed loyalty was visible on its own. I believed time spoke louder than positioning. I believed being indispensable meant being secure. I was wrong, but not in the way people usually mean. The first moment I remember wasn't dramatic. That's probably why it stayed with me. It happened in a meeting I almost didn't attend. I was asked to join late, added to the calendar after it had already been sent out. No explanation, just a forwarded invite and a short message. Can you sit in and take notes? That phrasing was familiar. I didn't question it. The room was already full when I arrived. People were mid-discussion, confident, and energized. Slides were moving quickly. Decisions were being framed as inevitable. I took my usual seat, slightly off to the side, laptop open, posture neutral, listening mode. About 20 minutes in, the conversation shifted to a process I had designed years earlier. Not just contributed to, designed. I recognized the language immediately, the structure, the assumptions, even the limitations. I knew where it worked and where it quietly broke under pressure. One of my colleagues began explaining it to the group. He spoke with certainty, using simplified language. He skipped over the edge cases. He framed the system as more flexible than it actually was. Heads nodded. No one questioned him. The room accepted the version he presented. I waited, not because I was unsure, but because I assumed someone would ask me to clarify. After all, I was there. My name was on the original documentation. I had trained half the people in that room on this very system. No one did. At one point, the facilitator asked, "Does anyone see any risks with this approach?" The question hung in the air. I felt the familiar instinct to step in gently, to add nuance, without disrupting momentum. Before I could speak, the colleague presenting smiled and said, "We've already pressure tested it. Ethan helped build it, so we're covered." There was no malice in his tone. He wasn't trying to erase me. In his mind, he was probably acknowledging my contribution. But something in that sentence landed wrong. I hadn't helped build it. I had built it, alone, quietly, over months, and I had not pressure tested this version. The one he was describing didn't exist yet. I opened my mouth to correct the misunderstanding, and then I stopped. Not because I was afraid, because I didn't want to slow things down, because the room felt decided, because I told myself it wasn't the right moment. I typed a note instead. Clarify limitations later. The meeting moved on. Afterward, a few people thanked me for the notes. One person said, "That was helpful context." No one mentioned the system again. No one followed up with questions. The moment passed. But I didn't forget it. That was the first small cut. Not an insult, not a slight anyone else would have noticed, just a quiet repositioning. My role had shifted from author to supporting evidence, from source to footnote. I told myself I was being sensitive, that these things happen in teams, that credit is fluid. I had been around long enough to know that titles and ownership blur over time. Still, something stayed with me. In the weeks that followed, I noticed variations of the same pattern. Ideas I introduced in private would resurface in meetings without my name attached. Decisions would be made using my frameworks, but I'd be informed afterward, not consulted before. When I did speak up, it was often to clarify details, not direction. People listened, but only long enough to extract the piece they needed. Then the conversation moved on without me. None of this rose to the level of confrontation. There was nothing to challenge directly. That was the problem. The disrespect was small enough to dismiss, but consistent enough to feel deliberate, even if it wasn't. I began to understand something uncomfortable. Perception doesn't change because of accuracy. It changes because of repetition. And the version of me being repeated in that room was no longer the one I recognized. I didn't become angry. I became alert. For the first time, I started paying attention not just to what people said, but to when they stopped looking in my direction, to how often my presence was assumed rather than requested, to how easily my silence was used to validate decisions I hadn't actually endorsed. That meeting, the one I almost skipped, was the first time I realized something had shifted, not in how I worked, but in how I was being used. And once you notice that kind of shift, it's impossible to unsee it. I didn't confront anyone. I didn't make a point. I didn't demand credit. I did something else. I remembered. After that first moment, nothing changed on the surface. I still had my desk. My inbox is still full. My calendar remained crowded with meetings where my role was assumed rather than defined. If anything, things felt smoother, more efficient, which made it easier to ignore the quiet discomfort settling in. That's how normalization works, not through shock, but through repetition without consequence. I started noticing how often my contributions were treated as ambient rather than intentional. When something went right, it was attributed to the team. When something went wrong, I was looped in to fix it quietly. I became the person people trusted with problems, but not with direction. At first, I explained it away. I told myself this was the natural evolution of seniority, that visibility fades as responsibility deepens, that leadership sometimes means stepping back. But there was a difference between stepping back and being stepped over. In meetings, I watched patterns repeat. Someone would ask a question that pointed directly at an area I managed. Instead of addressing me, they would look to my manager. My manager would then turn to me for confirmation, often rephrasing my answer as his own. The room accepted it without noticing the handoff. I didn't interrupt. I didn't correct the attribution. I nodded and moved on. Part of me believed that pushing back would make me look territorial, defensive, difficult. I had spent years cultivating an image of calm reliability, and I didn't want to fracture it over something that could be dismissed as ego, so I stayed quiet. That silence began to teach people something about me, that I would absorb discomfort without complaint, that I would trade recognition for harmony, that I could be relied on to support decisions even when I wasn't consulted. Once people learn that, they adjust their behavior accordingly. Requests started coming later, closer to deadlines. Information was shared after decisions had already been made. I was no longer in the room where direction was shaped. I was in the room where execution was assigned. And I accepted it. I told myself this was still influence, just indirect, that my fingerprints were on everything that mattered, that my value wasn't diminished just because it wasn't acknowledged. But the emotional cost of that belief began to surface in small ways. A tightness in my chest when someone else presented my work. A moment of hesitation before speaking, wondering if it was worth it. A growing awareness that my voice was becoming optional. What made it harder was that no one was openly unkind. There were no raised voices, no dismissive comments, just a steady erosion of presence. When performance reviews came around again, the language stayed the same. Rock solid, always dependable, no concerns. I waited for the next sentence, for something about trajectory, leadership, expanded scope. It never came. Instead, my manager smiled and said, "Honestly, Ethan, you're the easiest person to manage. You just get things done." He meant it as praise. I heard it as a ceiling. Being easy to manage meant I wasn't being considered. I wasn't a problem to solve or a potential to develop. I was stable, predictable, finished. That was the moment I realized I had helped normalize my own marginalization. Not because I lacked skill, but because I had mistaken tolerance for trust and silence for strategy. I began to see how often I had rationalized moments that deserved attention, how often I had told myself, this isn't the hill to die on. And while that was true in isolation, the hills added up. Each small dismissal lowered the bar for the next one. I wasn't angry at my colleagues. I was disappointed in my own assumptions. I had believed that being consistently excellent would naturally lead to being consistently valued. What I was learning was more uncomfortable. Systems don't reward what they don't have to fight for. By staying agreeable, I had made myself frictionless. And frictionless things are easy to move around, or remove entirely. Still, I didn't confront anyone, not yet, because even then, I wasn't ready to change my behavior. I was still hoping the system would correct itself, that someone would notice the imbalance and address it without being prompted. That hope kept me quiet longer than it should have. But something had shifted internally, a subtle recalibration. I began observing not just how people treated me, but how they relied on me without involving me. How often my silence was interpreted as consent. I was no longer just experiencing disrespect, I was participating in its normalization. And once I understood that, staying unaware was no longer an option. There comes a point when patterns stop feeling accidental. For me, that point arrived not through a single event, but through clarity. I began to see the role I had been placed into, not formally, not maliciously, but consistently. It was a role shaped as much by my behavior as by others' expectations. I was the reliable one, the stabilizer, the person you involve once the direction is already decided. I wasn't brought in to imagine the future. I was brought in to make sure the present didn't collapse. When leadership discussions happened, they happened without me. When implementation conversations began, my name appeared, not because I demanded it, but because I had become synonymous with execution. At first, that role felt honorable. There's pride in being trusted to handle complexity, in being the person others lean on when things matter. But slowly, I realized something unsettling. Trust without influence is just dependence. People depended on me, but they didn't defer to me. They assumed I would take whatever was handed to me and make it work. That assumption shaped how they treated my time, my input, and eventually my presence. I noticed how often my calendar was filled with other people's priorities. Meetings scheduled without context, requests phrased as afterthoughts. I was rarely asked if something was feasible, only how soon I could deliver it. When I did raise concerns, they were acknowledged politely and overridden gently. We'll figure it out. Let's try it and adjust later. The underlying message was clear. Your job is to adapt, not to direct. And I adapted. I rarely said no. I reframed impossible timelines into realistic ones behind the scenes. I shielded leadership from consequences by absorbing pressure quietly. When mistakes happened, I fixed them before they surfaced. I had become a buffer. Buffers are useful. They absorb shock. They protect the core, but they are also unseen. And when they wear down, they're replaced, not celebrated. I began to understand that the role assigned to me wasn't about my potential. It was about my predictability. I had proven over time that I wouldn't disrupt momentum, that I wouldn't challenge authority publicly, that I would prioritize outcomes over credit. So that's what I was used for. New initiatives were launched without my involvement. I was looped in only when something needed structure, when someone needed to understand what had gone wrong, when a client required reassurance that details were under control. I wasn't excluded out of hostility, I was excluded for convenience. The most difficult realization was that I had helped write this script. Every time I stayed quiet to keep the peace. Every time I downplayed my contribution. Every time I chose professionalism over presence. I told myself I was being strategic, that I was playing the long game. But long games only work if you're actually playing. At some point, my role stopped evolving. It solidified. Others grew around me, moved into new positions, took on new narratives. I stayed where I was, not because I couldn't move, but because no one imagined me anywhere else. I wasn't being held back. I was being held in place. And still, I didn't push. Not because I lacked awareness, but because I believed that if I kept delivering, the system would eventually recalibrate, that someone would notice the imbalance and correct it. That belief kept me effective and quietly stagnant. What I didn't yet understand was this: roles once assigned rarely change on their own. They change when behavior changes, or when absence forces reevaluation. At that point, I hadn't changed my behavior, and I was still very present. So the role remained reliable, useful, invisible. It wasn't a role given to me in a meeting or written in a document. It was a role reinforced by every interaction, every assumption, every unchallenged moment. And the longer I stayed inside it, the harder it became for anyone, including me, to imagine something different. That realization didn't make me angry, it made me still. Because stillness, I was about to learn, can be the beginning of something else. The day something shifted didn't look important from the outside. There was no argument, no confrontation, no dramatic announcement that changed the temperature of the room. In fact, if you had asked anyone else, they probably wouldn't remember it at all. I remember it clearly. It was late afternoon, the kind of hour where the office grows quieter, but not calmer. Most people were still at their desks, but mentally elsewhere. I had just finished resolving an issue that had been escalating for weeks. A client-side complication that, if left unchecked, would have turned into something much louder. I closed my laptop and leaned back in my chair, waiting for the familiar sense of relief. The quiet satisfaction of having prevented a problem before it became visible. It didn't come. Instead, I felt a strange distance. Not frustration, not resentment, just clarity. A message came through from my manager. Short, neutral. Thanks for handling that. We're moving forward with the original plan. I reread it once, then again. The original plan was the one I had flagged as fragile. The one I had outlined concerns about in writing. The one I had just spent hours stabilizing. In that moment, something in me finally stopped negotiating with reality. I realized that my effort wasn't shaping decisions. It was being used to cushion them. My work existed to make other people's choices survivable, not better. That understanding settled quietly. No emotion attached, just truth. I looked around the office. The glass walls, the muted conversations, the screens were glowing with urgency that wasn't shared evenly. And for the first time in years, I didn't feel responsible for holding it all together. I felt separate, not disconnected, released. I thought back over the last decade. How often I had absorbed pressure so others could stay comfortable. How often I had translated vague directives into functional systems. How often I had protected leadership from the consequences of their own blind spots. I had done it willingly, proudly even. But pride doesn't protect you from being taken for granted. That afternoon, I didn't decide to leave. I didn't decide to confront anyone. I didn't even decide to change jobs. What I decided was smaller and more significant. I decided to stop filling in the gaps automatically. I still did my work. I still delivered what I was responsible for. But I stopped preemptively correcting decisions I wasn't included in. I stopped volunteering fixes for problems no one acknowledged. I stopped translating chaos into calm without being asked. It wasn't passive-aggressive. It wasn't neglect. It was alignment. If I wasn't part of the decision, I wouldn't quietly become its safety net. That choice felt uncomfortable at first, almost disloyal. Years of habit don't disappear overnight. I caught myself drafting emails I didn't send, preparing explanations no one had requested. And then I stopped. What surprised me was how little anyone noticed. Meetings continued. Plans moved forward. People spoke with confidence. The machine kept running, just less smoothly. Minor issues surfaced. Small delays appeared. Nothing catastrophic, just enough friction to be felt. And still no one connected it to me. That's when I understood something crucial. My silence had been doing more than I realized. It had been masking structural weaknesses. And now that silence had changed. Not outwardly, internally. I wasn't withdrawing. I was observing. I began paying closer attention to how decisions were made without me, and how often those decisions quietly relied on knowledge only I had. I noticed which questions were never asked because people assumed I'd catch things later. I no longer rushed to reassure. I no longer smoothed things over instinctively. For the first time, my restraint had direction. That day didn't feel like rebellion. It felt like self-respect. And once that shift happens, you don't go back to the old version of quiet. You learn the difference between silence that serves others and silence that protects you. After that day, my silence changed character. Before, it had been reflexive, a habit shaped by years of prioritizing harmony over friction. Now, it was deliberate, measured, purposeful. From the outside, nothing about me seemed different. I still showed up on time, still responded to messages, still completed my responsibilities with the same level of care. That was important. I didn't want to give anyone an excuse to question my professionalism. But internally, I had redrawn a line. I no longer filled in gaps that were created by decisions I wasn't part of. I no longer translated unclear thinking into clean execution unless it was explicitly my role. And most importantly, I stopped offering unsolicited solutions in rooms where my voice had already been deprioritized. This wasn't about proving a point, it was about accuracy. If I was going to be treated as peripheral to strategy, then I would stop acting like its invisible backbone. What surprised me was how quickly my restraint was misinterpreted. People began to assume I was disengaged, less invested. A few comments floated my way, casual, half joking. "You're quiet today. Everything okay?" I smiled, answered politely, and continued listening. They were used to my silence carrying weight. My quiet presence meant that things were under control. Now, my silence simply existed, and that unsettled them. Meetings started ending with unresolved questions. Follow-ups became more frequent. I was copied on longer email chains, often late in the process, with vague requests like thoughts or any concerns. I responded carefully, precisely. I answered the question that was asked, no more, no less. If someone asked whether a plan was feasible, I gave a factual answer. If they asked for input after a decision was made, I acknowledged it without rewriting the strategy. I wasn't withholding knowledge. I was respecting boundaries that had previously only flowed one way. At first, I wondered if this made me petty. I examined my own motives closely. That mattered to me. I didn't want to become someone who played games or punished people indirectly. What I realized was this. I wasn't changing who I was changing what I allowed my silence to be used for. There's a difference between generosity and self-erasure. I had crossed that line without noticing. Now I was stepping back, not to withdraw, but to rebalance. Others, however, didn't see it that way. A manager pulled me aside one afternoon and asked gently if everything was all right. I told him the truth, that I was focused, that I was prioritizing my responsibilities, that I didn't have concerns I hadn't already shared. He nodded, slightly confused. I could see him recalibrating his expectations, trying to understand why the system felt different. But systems don't announce when a stabilizing force changes its behavior. They just start to wobble. Small things began slipping through, not catastrophically, but noticeably. A timeline is extended. A client asked sharper questions. A presentation required revisions that could have been avoided. And for the first time, those issues weren't quietly rerouted to me for cleanup. They surfaced. Still, no one accused me of anything. There was no blame, just a growing sense that something had shifted. I continued to observe, to document, to learn. I paid attention to which people reached out proactively and which only reacted when friction appeared. I noticed how often my input was sought too late, and how often it was still assumed I would solve things retroactively. I didn't rush to correct those assumptions. This phase taught me something valuable. Silence, when chosen consciously, becomes information. It reveals where responsibility truly lies. It exposes how much of the system was leaning on unspoken labor. Most importantly, it showed me how easily people confuse availability with obligation. By staying calm and consistent, I removed the narrative that I was acting out of emotion. There was no drama to point to, no behavior to criticize, just a subtle absence of the invisible support they had grown accustomed to. And that absence spoke more clearly than any complaint ever could. I wasn't trying to teach anyone a lesson. I was learning one myself. I was learning that being underestimated can be a liability or a position, and I was beginning to understand how to stand in that position without announcing it. While things on the surface continued as usual, something else was happening underneath, quietly, methodically, without urgency. What they never noticed was that I had always been observant. Long before I stopped filling in gaps automatically, I had been watching how the system actually worked. Not how it was described in meetings, but how it behaved under pressure. Who made decisions, who avoided them, where information was pooled, and where it disappeared. I had learned these things out of necessity. When you're the person responsible for execution, you develop a different relationship with reality. You notice what breaks, what gets delayed, what assumptions quietly fail and need to be repaired before anyone else sees them. For years, I treated that awareness as internal, professional, something you carry but don't display. Now I began treating it as data. I didn't announce what I was doing. I didn't share my observations. I simply started documenting more intentionally. Not in a paranoid way, in a precise one. I kept track of decisions I wasn't consulted on that later required correction. I noted which projects depended heavily on undocumented processes I had created. I observed how often external partners reached out to me directly, not because of my title, but because of trust built over time. Those relationships were especially important. Over the years, I had become a quiet constant for several clients and vendors. When teams changed, when leadership rotated, I stayed. I answered questions. I explained the context. I followed through. I never used those relationships for leverage. I didn't need to. But I did notice who trusted me with their concerns and who didn't trust the system as much as they pretended to. I also started learning in a more focused way, not in bursts of ambition, but in steady increments. I deepened my understanding of contract structures. I paid closer attention to how budgets were justified and where flexibility actually lived. I refreshed skills that had once been central to my role, but had been delegated upward as I became reliable. I wasn't preparing to leave. Not consciously, I was preparing to understand. There's a difference. When you prepare to leave, you rush, you look for exits, you imagine alternatives. When you prepare to understand, you slow down, you gather clarity, you position yourself without moving yet. That's what I was doing. I began seeing the organization less as a hierarchy and more as a network. Certain nodes carried more weight than their title suggested. Certain voices mattered only in specific rooms, and certain dependencies were never acknowledged because doing so would expose how fragile some decisions really were. I was one of those dependencies, not because I was irreplaceable, but because replacing me would require surfacing knowledge no one else had bothered to learn. They assumed that knowledge was embedded in systems, in documents, in procedures. It wasn't. It was embedded in judgment, in pattern recognition, in experience layered over time. And judgment doesn't transfer cleanly. Still, I didn't hoard information. I didn't sabotage processes. I continued doing my job exactly as defined. But I stopped extending beyond it without intention. What they never noticed was that I had also stopped narrating my value. I no longer explained how pieces fit together unless asked directly. I no longer preempted questions with context. I answered precisely what was requested and nothing more. That restraint created space. And in that space, Shadis says, their assumptions began to echo. They assumed systems were self-sustaining. They assumed risks had been addressed. They assumed continuity where there was only habit. Meanwhile, I was becoming clearer about my own position. I wasn't angry. I wasn't plotting. I was aligning reality with visibility. I began to see where my skills translated beyond this one environment. How the things I did quietly, analysis, stabilization, interpretation, were valued differently elsewhere. How my temperament, once mistaken for passivity, could be an advantage in settings that respected depth over display. That realization didn't inflate my ego, it grounded me, because it showed me that the issue wasn't my capability, it was context. And context can change. I also noticed something else, something subtle but important. The more I stopped compensating, the more others started compensating poorly. Not because they were incompetent, but because they had never been required to carry that weight. Mistakes weren't dramatic. They were inefficient. Conversations became longer. Decisions became noisier. Confidence increased, but precision declined. And still, no one traced it back to me. That anonymity was a gift. It allowed me to see the system without being entangled in its reactions, to prepare without being suspected, to learn without pressure. I didn't know yet where this would lead. I only knew that I was no longer moving unconsciously. What they never noticed was that the person they thought they understood, the quiet, reliable presence, was still there. But he was no longer operating on autopilot. He was paying attention. The realization didn't arrive as a shock. It arrived as confirmation. By the time it became clear, I had already been circling it for weeks, maybe longer. I just hadn't allowed myself to name it yet. What I discovered wasn't a secret document or a hidden clause. It wasn't leverage in the dramatic sense. There was no single point of failure I could expose or exploit. What I discovered was simpler and more decisive. I finally understood where my value actually lived and who depended on it without acknowledging it. It happened during a routine review of a project timeline. I had been asked, late as usual, to look over a proposal before it went out to a major client. The request came with an unspoken assumption: you'll catch anything important. I read through it carefully, line by line, not because I felt obligated, but because I wanted to see what would happen if I didn't intervene automatically. The proposal was polished, confident, and built on several assumptions that only worked because of invisible decisions I had been making for years. Assumptions about turnaround time, assumptions about risk tolerance, assumptions about how much flexibility the client would allow before pushing back. None of those assumptions was written anywhere. They lived in a precinct, in experience, in judgment calls made quietly, repeatedly, and successfully by me. I realized then that the organization wasn't running on systems alone. It was running on borrowed intuition. And intuition doesn't scale when the person carrying it stops compensating. That was the private reveal. Not that I was indispensable, but that I had been functioning as an unrecognized interface between theory and reality, between what leadership wanted to promise and what could actually be delivered. And I was doing it without authority, without acknowledgement, without protection. That clarity didn't make me feel powerful. It made me feel exposed. Because once you see that kind of dependency, you also see how vulnerable it makes you if things go wrong. If a project failed, if a client pushed back, if assumptions collapsed, the system would look for someone to blame. And the quiet one is always easiest to point to. I asked myself a hard question that evening, sitting alone with my notebook open. If this structure breaks, who absorbs the impact? The answer was obvious. I had been absorbing it all along. That's when another layer of understanding settled in. I wasn't just being overlooked. I was being shielded from visibility in ways that protected others. As long as I stayed behind the scenes, leadership could speak confidently. Sales could promise aggressively. Timelines could be optimistic. Because someone, me, would quietly make it work or quietly take the hit. And if it didn't work, I wouldn't be in the room to explain why. That realization didn't trigger anger. It triggered restraint. I stopped editing the proposal beyond what was explicitly asked. I flagged a few surface-level risks. I left the deeper assumptions untouched, not to cause failure, but to stop preventing reality from surfacing. When the proposal went out, the client came back with questions, reasonable ones, specific ones, the kind that requires experience to answer cleanly. They asked for me directly. That moment mattered more than anyone realized. Not because it was dramatic, but because it was revealing. The client trusted me, not the structure, not the titles, not the slides. Me, I answered their questions calmly, accurately, without undermining anyone. And in doing so, I saw exactly where my leverage lived. Not in confrontation, not in exposure, but in choice. I could continue being the invisible translator. Or I could reposition myself, without noise, into a role where my judgment was acknowledged, protected, and compensated. That was the real reveal. Not what I could do, but what I no longer had to do. I didn't share this realization with anyone. Not with colleagues, not with mentors, not even with myself out loud. I just let it settle. Because clarity doesn't require announcement. It requires alignment. And once alignment happens, the next steps become quieter, but irreversible. I wasn't planning revenge. I wasn't planning an escape. I was planning accuracy. And accuracy, once you commit to it, changes everything. Clarity has a way of narrowing your options. Once you understand what's really happening, you can't unknow it. You can pretend for a while, you can delay, but eventually you reach a point where continuing as you are becomes more exhausting than changing. That's where I found myself. I didn't rush into a decision. I mapped the landscape first, quietly, honestly. There were several paths open to me. I could confront leadership, ask for recognition, authority, and a revised role. On paper, that seemed reasonable. I had tenure, performance history, evidence, but I also knew the unspoken cost. Confrontations change how you're perceived, even when they're justified. Once you ask to be seen differently, you risk being labeled difficult, especially if the system benefits from you staying exactly where you are. I could stay silent and continue as before, accept the role, do the work, absorb the pressure. There was comfort in that path, familiarity, predictability. I knew exactly how to survive there. But survival wasn't the same as alignment. I could leave, find a new role where my skills are valued more explicitly. Many people would have chosen that option immediately. It would have been clean, simple, a reset. But something held me back. Not loyalty, clarity. I wasn't done understanding the system yet. Then there was the final option, the one that felt both quiet and irreversible. I could stop anchoring myself to a structure that only recognized me when it needed cushioning. I could let my role resolve naturally, without drama, without accusation, by choosing not to protect it from the consequences of its own assumptions. That option didn't require an announcement, it required patience. I didn't frame it as a strategy, I framed it as integrity. If I wasn't going to be included in decisions, I wouldn't be responsible for their outcomes. If my judgment wasn't trusted publicly, I wouldn't loan it privately. If my role had been reduced to execution, then execution was all I would offer. That meant accepting uncertainty, letting discomfort surface, allowing the organization to feel what it had been insulated from. I spent several evenings thinking through the implications. Not just professionally, but ethically, I asked myself where the line was between detachment and negligence. The answer mattered. I wasn't withholding effort. I wasn't sabotaging anything. I was simply no longer overfunctioning. There's a difference. Once I saw that difference clearly, the decision made itself. I chose the path that didn't require permission. I chose to let my value become visible by no longer disguising it as effort. That decision was irreversible, not because it was dramatic, but because it changed how I related to the work. Once you stop tying your identity to being the quiet fix, you can't go back to performing that role unconsciously. I didn't resign, I didn't confront anyone, I didn't update my resume. I adjusted my posture. And that subtle shift began setting things in motion almost immediately. Meetings felt different. Not tense, just more exposed. Questions lingered longer. Assumptions were voiced more loudly because no one was quietly correcting them in advance. I noticed how often people looked around the room for confirmation that didn't come, and I stayed calm because I knew that whatever happened next would reveal more than any conversation ever could. This wasn't about winning, it wasn't about proving a point. It was about choosing not to participate in my own diminishment anymore. And once that choice is made, the system has only two options: adjust or push you out. I was prepared for either. Once the decision was made, everything slowed down. Not externally, internally. I stopped narrating my thoughts even to myself. I didn't rehearse explanations. I didn't imagine future conversations. I focused on what I could control: my actions, my boundaries, and my preparation. If the system was going to adjust or push me out, I wanted to be ready for both outcomes without forcing either. I began taking care of things that had long been deferred. Quiet, practical steps. No grand gestures. I organized my work with more precision than before. Documentation that had once lived in my head was written clearly, neutrally, without interpretation. Not to protect myself, but to ensure accuracy. If I were ever questioned, the record would speak for itself. I reviewed contracts more closely, not to challenge them, but to understand how responsibility was distributed, where accountability was explicit, and where it was conveniently vague. I paid attention to how decisions translated into obligations: who committed, who approved, who executed. Patterns emerged quickly once I stopped smoothing over the gaps. At the same time, I began reconnecting quietly with people outside the organization. Not job hunting, just conversations. Former colleagues, long-standing clients, industry contacts who knew how I worked because they had seen me under pressure. I didn't pitch myself, I listened. I asked questions. I learned how my skill set was perceived beyond the walls I had grown accustomed to. Those conversations were grounding. They reminded me that what I had normalized internally wasn't universal, that other environments valued judgment, not just output. That being calm didn't mean being peripheral. Still, I didn't announce any of this. I didn't want rumors or narratives to form around my intentions. Silence protected me, not as invisibility, but as flexibility. At work, the consequences of my restraint continued to surface. Timelines slipped slightly, not disastrously, just enough to require explanation. Clients asked for clarification earlier. Internal reviews became longer and more cautious. I noticed how often people searched for certainty in places where it used to be quietly supplied. No one accused me of anything. That's important, because the moment someone accuses you, the story becomes emotional, defensive, personal. This story remains structural. I continued doing my job exactly as defined. No more, no less. And because of that, everything that emerged was attributable to process, not attitude. That distinction mattered. I also prepared myself financially, not out of fear, but responsibility. I simplified expenses, built a buffer, reduced dependencies. Not because I expected termination, but because clarity invites readiness. What surprised me most during this phase was how calm I felt. I had expected anxiety, sleepless nights, second guessing. Instead, I felt anchored. For the first time in years, my internal sense of self wasn't tied to whether things ran smoothly around me. I wasn't scanning for problems to fix preemptively. I wasn't measuring my worth by how much friction I absorbed. I was present without being porous. People responded to that in subtle ways. Some leaned in, seeking reassurance. Others pulled back, uncomfortable with the absence of my quiet correction. A few began documenting their own decisions more carefully. And still, no one said anything directly. That's the thing about systems. They resist naming what's changing for as long as possible. They prefer ambiguity over adjustment. But ambiguity has a cost. Eventually, the cost shows up somewhere. I didn't know when the inflection point would come. I only knew that when it did, I would meet it without scrambling. Because I wasn't hiding. I was moving in silence. The consequences didn't arrive all at once. They appeared gradually in places no one expected to look. At first, it was framed as bad timing. A deliverable needed revision closer to a deadline than usual. A client requested additional clarification that hadn't been anticipated. A review cycle is extended by a week. Small inconveniences, easy to dismiss. No alarms were raised, no emergency meetings called, but I could feel the shift. The organization had grown used to a certain rhythm, one that depended on quiet correction and invisible judgment. Without that constant calibration, things didn't break, they drifted. Drift is harder to diagnose than failure. People began asking more questions, but not better ones. Meetings grew longer, not clearer. Confidence stayed high, but precision declined. Decisions were still made quickly, but they required more cleanup afterward. That cleanup used to land with me automatically. Now it didn't, and so the weight redistributed itself unevenly. I watched colleagues work harder without realizing why their effort wasn't producing the same results. I saw managers become more involved in the details they had previously ignored. I noticed how often leadership asked for updates on things that had once progressed quietly without oversight. The system was feeling friction, and it didn't yet know where it was coming from. What struck me most was that no one looked at me differently. There was no suspicion, no resentment, no blame. I was still doing my job. That made the consequences harder to localize. Clients began requesting more direct communication. They asked follow-up questions earlier in the process, not because something was wrong, but because something felt less certain. One long-term client reached out to me privately after a call and said, "Things feel a little less grounded lately. Is that just us?" I chose my words carefully. I didn't criticize anyone. I didn't offer an inside perspective. I simply answered within my role. "We're still aligning internally," I said. "I'll make sure your concerns are documented," which was true. But it wasn't reassurance. Internally, the tone shifted subtly. People became more cautious, more defensive, more eager to clarify their own responsibilities. Documentation increased, not because of policy changes, but because uncertainty demands proof. I noticed how often my name appeared in email threads now, not as a solution, but as a reference point. "Ethan, can you confirm?" "Ethan, is this aligned with previous work?" "Ethan, do you see any issues?" I responded thoughtfully, precisely, without stepping beyond the question. And with each response, the absence of my former role became more visible. What they were feeling wasn't my withdrawal. It was the exposure of assumptions they had never been required to test. Still, no one named it, because naming it would require admitting that something foundational had been taken for granted. I began to see how discomfort travels upward in organizations. It doesn't move directly. It accumulates. It shows up as inefficiency, as hesitation, as the need for more oversight. By the time it reaches decision makers, it's been abstracted into language like misalignment or process gaps. I heard those words in meetings now. I listened. I said nothing. Not because I didn't care, but because caring no longer meant compensating. The most revealing moment came during a review session when a senior leader asked almost casually, "Have we always done it this way?" The room went quiet. No one answered immediately. I knew the answer. I had shaped the way it used to be done, but the version they were experiencing now was different, and no one could articulate why. Eventually, someone said, "I think it's just growing pains." Everyone nodded. I didn't correct them, because it wasn't growing pains. It was dependency pain, and dependencies only become visible when they're tested. At this stage, the consequences weren't catastrophic. They weren't even dramatic, but they were cumulative. And once accumulation begins, reversal becomes difficult. I could feel the system reaching for equilibrium. It just didn't yet know what it had lost. By the time anyone tried to fix what was happening, the language had already shifted. No one said my name at first. They didn't say Ethan. They said things like capacity, bandwidth, and process ownership. They talked about alignment issues and communication breakdowns, abstract problems, safe problems, problems that didn't require accountability. Meetings were added. Frameworks were proposed. Someone suggested a task force. Another suggested new tools. The instinct was to solve the discomfort structurally without acknowledging that the structure had always depended on something informal and human. On judgment, on continuity, on quiet correction. I watched these conversations with a strange sense of detachment. Not satisfied, not bitterness, just recognition. They weren't wrong to look for solutions. They were wrong to believe the solutions were still available in the same form. Because some things can't be retrofitted once they've been taken for granted for too long. At one point, leadership requested a comprehensive review of workflows I had historically overseen. They framed it as optimization, efficiency, risk management. I complied fully. I provided documentation, clear timelines, objective summaries. I answered questions honestly. I did not editorialize. I did not reinsert myself as the invisible translator. And that was when the gap became undeniable. The documentation showed what had been done, but not how decisions had been interpreted in real time. It showed procedures, not judgment. It showed steps, not instincts. They realized this slowly. You could see it in the way follow-up questions were asked, more detailed, more cautious, more uncertain. They were trying to extract something that had never lived on paper. Someone asked, "Is there a playbook for how these edge cases were handled?" I paused before answering. "No," I said calmly. "They were handled situationally." That answer landed heavier than I expected, because it revealed the truth without accusation. The system had relied on discretion without protecting or recognizing it. That's a dangerous arrangement for everyone involved. From that point on, the tone shifted from optimization to concern. Don't panic yet, but awareness. Leadership began asking whether certain commitments had been too ambitious, whether expectations needed to be reset, whether responsibilities should be rebalanced. I listened. I didn't volunteer to rebalance them myself. At some point, someone suggested I take on a more formal leadership role in the area. The suggestion came late and without preparation, a reactive move. It would have required me to retroactively own outcomes I had not been empowered to shape. I declined politely, not emotionally, not definitely, just clearly. I don't think that would be the right fit given how decisions are currently structured. There was silence after that, not because I was wrong, but because the timing was. They weren't offering growth, they were offering containment. And containment is what you reach for when something is already slipping. By then, trust had already shifted, not downward, but outward. Clients had begun requesting direct accountability. Internal teams were more cautious about commitments. The organization was expending more energy to achieve less certainty. And still, no one could point to a single cause. That's when you know it's too late to fix it cleanly. Because the problem isn't a process, it's a relationship that was never formally acknowledged. I wasn't angry when this became clear. I felt resolved. I had not engineered this outcome. I had simply stopped compensating for a system that refused to see what it relied on. The opportunity to address it collaboratively had passed, not because I withheld it, but because it was never asked for when it mattered. By the time they noticed the gap, they were standing on the wrong side of it. And when that happens, even good intentions feel like reactions instead of leadership. I didn't feel vindicated. I felt finished. Because once an organization scrambles to recover something it never named, the relationship changes permanently. Trust becomes transactional, recognition becomes retroactive, and alignment becomes impossible. What came next wasn't a surprise. It was a formality. The meeting was scheduled for 30 minutes. That alone told me what it was. Important conversations don't need an hour when the outcome has already been decided. They need just enough time to appear considerate. I walked into the room calmly, not guarded, not resigned, just present. Two people were there. One from leadership, one from HR. Both professional, both careful. They spoke first, as expected. They thanked me for my time, for my years of contribution, for my professionalism during a challenging period. The language was smooth, practiced. They spoke about restructuring, about evolving needs, about alignment. I listened without interruption. When they said the words, "We've decided to move in a different direction," I felt no surge of emotion, no tightening in my chest, just confirmation. This wasn't sudden, it was delayed. They explained the transition plan, the timeline, the severance, the logistics, everything was orderly, respectful. What stood out was what they didn't say. They didn't mention the recent instability, the client questions, the internal confusion. They didn't connect any of it to me, positively or negatively. In their version of events, my role had simply concluded. When they finished, they asked if I had any questions. I had one. Is this decision based on performance, I asked, or structure? They exchanged a brief look. Structure, they said. I nodded. That answer mattered. It meant there was nothing to defend, nothing to argue. Structures don't respond to emotion. They respond to design. I didn't challenge the decision. I didn't list accomplishments. I didn't remind them of anything they already knew, but hadn't acknowledged when it mattered. Instead, I said, I appreciate the clarity. That seemed to catch them off guard. They had prepared for disappointment, possibly frustration, maybe even negotiation, not acceptance. The rest of the meeting passed quickly. We stood, we shook hands. They thanked me again. And that was it. No heat, no confrontation in the traditional sense, just separation. In the days that followed, the response around the office was muted. A few surprised messages, a few careful goodbyes. Most people didn't know what to say, so they said very little. I didn't fill the silence. I wrapped up my responsibilities precisely, documented what was mine to document, handed over what was appropriate. I didn't over-explain. I didn't dramatize the exit. I left the same way I had worked, cleanly. What struck me most during that time was how quickly the narrative formed without me. People speculated, assumed, explained it to themselves in ways that felt comfortable. I didn't correct them. I didn't need to, because my story no longer belonged to that environment. Losing my job hurt, not because of pride, but because of finality. 10 years distilled into an ending I hadn't authored. That kind of loss deserves to be acknowledged honestly. But hurt doesn't require noise. I allowed myself to feel it privately, to sit with the quiet disorientation that follows when a long chapter closes without ceremony. And then I moved on. Not dramatically, not definitely, just deliberately. What they never saw, and never needed to, was that this ending had already repositioned me. Not as a former employee, but as someone no longer defined by the constraints of that structure. The confrontation had happened. It just hadn't needed heat. After I left, there was a stretch of time that felt unusually quiet. Not empty, just unstructured. For years, my sense of rhythm had been tied to calendars, deliverables, and the subtle urgency of other people's expectations. Without that, mornings opened up differently, slower, less defined. At first, that space felt uncomfortable. Not because I missed the work, but because I had grown used to orienting myself around what needed fixing. Without problems to stabilize, I had to learn how to listen inward instead of outward. I didn't rush to fill the silence. I took walks. I thought. I slept more than I had in years. I let the emotional residue settle without trying to extract meaning from it too quickly. Losing my job had hurt. That didn't vanish just because I was calm about it. There were moments, small, unexpected ones, where the weight returned. A habit of checking my phone at certain hours. A reflex to solve problems that weren't mine anymore. I didn't judge those moments, I let them pass. Gradually, something else took their place. Perspective. I began to see my career not as a single trajectory that had ended, but as a set of capabilities that had outgrown one context. What I had done quietly for years, interpreting complexity, stabilizing systems, earning trust, wasn't tied to a title. It was portable. And more importantly, it was selective. I became more intentional about where I placed my attention. I spoke with people who valued depth over speed, who asked questions before making promises, who understood that calm wasn't absence, it was discipline. When opportunities came, I didn't chase them. I evaluated them. I asked myself, can I do this? But would this require me to become invisible again? That question changed everything. Eventually, I stepped into a role that looked very different from the one I had left. Not bigger, not louder, just clearer. My responsibilities were explicit. My judgment was acknowledged. Decisions were shared, not assumed. And when something fell outside my scope, it stayed there. I no longer absorbed ambiguity by default. What surprised me most was how natural this felt, how little adjustment it required once the boundaries were clear. I hadn't needed to become more assertive or more forceful. I had simply needed to stop over-functioning. The person I am now isn't harder, or colder, or more guarded. I'm just more accurate. I speak when my input is relevant. I stay silent when it isn't. And that silence no longer carries the burden of unspoken responsibility. I'm still calm, still observant, still quiet, But I'm no longer invisible, and I don't need to be recognized by everyone, only by the structures I choose to participate in. Occasionally, I hear updates about my former workplace through mutual contacts, through industry conversations. The tone is neutral, sometimes strained. I don't ask for details. Whatever adjustments they've made are theirs to make. My role there has resolved. What remains with me is the lesson, not as resentment, but as clarity. Loyalty without boundaries leads to erosion. Silence without intention leads to misinterpretation, and being underestimated is only dangerous if you believe it. I don't measure success now by how indispensable I feel, but by how aligned I am, by whether my presence is chosen, not assumed. That alignment brings a quieter kind of confidence, the kind that doesn't need to prove itself. This isn't a story about winning. There was no moment where I walked back into the building transformed, no dramatic reversal where everyone suddenly understood what they had lost. Real life rarely offers that kind of symmetry. What this story is about is quite accurate. For a long time, I believed that doing good work was enough, that consistency would eventually speak louder than positioning, that loyalty would naturally translate into security. That belief wasn't naive, it was human. Many of us are taught that if we stay patient, useful, and calm, things will balance out on their own. Sometimes they do, and sometimes they don't. When they don't, the danger isn't that others fail to see your value. The danger is that you begin to measure yourself by how little space you take up. That's how erosion happens. Slowly, politely, without conflict. I didn't lose my job because I was ineffective. I lost it because my role had been quietly reduced to something easier to remove. That truth took time to accept. Losing my job hurt, not because I was unprepared, but because it forced me to see how much of myself I had given without asking whether it was being held responsibly. What changed my life wasn't confrontation. It wasn't revenge. It was a decision to stop compensating for systems that refused to see what they relied on. The moment I chose accuracy over accommodation, everything else followed naturally. The system adjusted in the only way it knew how. And I adjusted by stepping into a context where my presence was deliberate, not assumed. If there's a lesson here, it's not be louder or demand more. It's simpler and harder. Pay attention to where your silence is being used. Notice when reliability turns into invisibility. And understand that being underestimated doesn't weaken you unless you stay where that underestimation defines you. You don't need to expose anyone. You don't need to dramatize your exit. You don't even need to explain yourself to people who benefited from not asking. Sometimes the most respectful thing you can do, for yourself and for others, is to stop playing a role that no longer fits. Quietly, cleanly, without bitterness. I share this story not as advice, but as a reflection. Because many people listening right now are probably standing where I once stood, being useful, being calm, being overlooked without being mistreated enough to justify leaving. If that's you, you don't need to rush. You don't need to burn bridges. But you might need to ask yourself one honest question. Are you choosing your silence, or has it simply been chosen for you? If this story resonated with you, I'd like to hear your thoughts. Have you ever experienced a moment where being dependable slowly turned into being invisible? And if so, what did you do next?